On Sunday, the migrant caravan finally reached the US border, and that means that I can't ignore this story any longer. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been watching this story ever since it developed, and there's been some tinfoil going on that kind of pushed it to the back burner for me. But the reality of the caravan is that it started during one of the biggest attempts at violating our rights in U.S. history, at least in recent U.S. history, and leading into an election that threatened to be riddled with voter fraud if the Democrats didn't get their way as the result of the election, some of which we've talked about. In addition, during the caravan's trek through Mexico, a crazed person that we still don't know anything about decided to mail a bunch of bombs to prominent Democrats, even though none of them were postmarked and apparently delivered by courier. And an insane leftist went out and shot up a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and even though he was a leftist, all of this got blamed on Trump. With all of this happening, it's easy to see that this story probably got pushed to the back burner by a lot of other outlets as well. There were major left-leaning outlets that wanted to keep the focus on this caravan coming across because our president was continually making threats against the people of the caravan and moving troops down to the border in order to take care of the caravan and assist ICE in processing the asylum seekers and the people that just wanted to storm the border. Myself and Representative Eric Swalwell got into it over this, or at least I tried to call him out on it, and he completely ignored me for it, because it didn't help to forward his narrative. But let's take a look at this caravan and why it seemed to almost drop out of the news, or at least get swallowed up by the 24-hour news cycle in this country, and why it suddenly became a big deal as soon as the caravan was on the border. Most people know and understand the fact that this is the second caravan that's come from Central America and approached our border. But the reason that I didn't report on it until the caravan got here was the fact that nobody remembers what happened to the caravan once it got here. The story completely disappeared from the news as the caravan approached the border and had been mostly disbanded by the time it got here. Asylum seekers went through, got processed, some of them were approved, the rest of them were denied and sent back to Mexico in order to make the trek back to their homelands or stay in Mexico per the Mexican government. The first caravan was marketed as an invasion force by people in the hard right of the media like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh. In fact, I've heard both men say the same thing about the first caravan. But for the most part, the caravan was not reported as being violent. We noted the fact that they were continuing to wave the flags of their home countries, but for the most part, it wasn't really worrisome, and we had faith in our Border Patrol and our ICE agents to take care of the problem in a meaningful fashion. In essence, the first caravan was not much of a story, it was just used as a story to try and distract from other things happening in the news. The second caravan gained immediately more attention than the first caravan did. The president started tweeting about it almost immediately, just as he did with the first caravan, but there was a lot more attention paid to the tweets, and in fact there was a lot more reporting that had been done on the caravan. People from all sorts of news outlets were traveling to Mexico as their passports allowed, and going through and interviewing people that were traveling in the caravan trying to get up to the United States, whether they were riding on the back of flatbed trucks, walking, taking transportation that had been provided to them by various Mexican cities. There was always room for somebody from one of these news outlets to come in and talk to the people in the caravan and hear some of their original intentions. It's important to note the fact that from almost the instant the caravan was formed, it was sold to the American people as a group of asylum seekers, only changing the title to migrants as they closer approached the border and started to get violent in the news. It's reasonable to believe that many of the people that were on the caravan were legitimately seeking asylum as they were going along, and this can be best proven by the fact that Mexico did offer asylum to everybody in the caravan. Mexico has been seeming to try and stay on the United States' good side ever since Trump was elected, and especially since the USMCA went into place. And there was some number of people that were on the caravan that did take the Mexican government up on asylum, applied for the asylum with the government, and started applying for jobs as they were going through. But the majority of the caravan insisted that they were going north, that they were going to push forward, and they were coming into the United States no matter what, come hell or high water. While the stories of the end of the first migrant caravan were largely lost in the news cycle by both the mainstream and alternative medias, there were reports that slipped through the cracks of both mainstream and alternative sources showing that migrants on the border were violent with Border Patrol and ICE agents that were tasked with protecting the border and making sure the caravan didn't come through. These migrants on the first trip were throwing rocks, bottles, and any other makeshift weapon they could get their hands on at the agents that were tasked with defending our nation's borders against the incoming caravan. And with that in mind, as soon as the people said that they were going to push north no matter what Mexico offered them, Donald Trump was ready to put a situation up in which our border was defended, but was also looking for ways to defuse the situation in a nonviolent fashion. While it is true that the commander-in-chief scrambled the National Guard to the border to help assist ICE agents with the incoming caravan, there have been options on the table from as early as when Trump started his campaign to try and end situations like this in a nonviolent fashion and make sure that everybody that came up to the border did get an asylum claim because they went through at a port of entry. In a more drastic move, the president assured the American people that if Mexico did nothing to help slow down or stop the caravan from approaching the U.S. border and getting over the border, that he would permanently close the border between the two countries. And there were a rash of people out there that were immediately ready to say that this violated some sort of international law or some sort of constitutional mandate, neither of which it actually violates. As our nation's chief law enforcement officer, the president actually does absolutely have the authority to close any border or port of entry into this country that he sees fit for as long as he feels necessary, including permanently or at least long enough to be undone by his successor in the presidency. However, I don't believe that the president wants to go through with that. I do believe he's thought it through and realized the economic impact that it would have both on Mexico, who he's trying to mend relationships with, and the border towns of the southern states, many of which have people that travel across the border daily to go to work or transport goods and services from one place to the other. It was well known and documented that the majority of the Hondurans and other Latin Americans that were traveling in the caravan were young military-aged men. This has been documented by both mainstream and alternative outlets across the media. While this is documented, we also know the fact that there were a number of women and children that were also traveling with the caravan for almost its entire journey. And there were many people that were in the alternative media and others on the right who were immediately ready to say that these women and children were going to be used as human shields as the caravan approached the border, and especially as ICE and National Guard agents would have their guns trained to the other side of the border. And as the caravan approached the border on Sunday, we saw just that happening. Reporting shows that the majority of the people in the caravan were actually peaceful as they approached the border and complied with Mexican law and Mexican officials as they approached the border. The people of Tijuana have the Honduran caravan housed in a sports stadium near the border, and the majority of people were just waiting to have their asylum claims processed, whether or not they passed or not. But there was a small group, about 500 people from most reports that I've seen, that did decide to do what all of us were afraid that the entire caravan was going to do from the time the caravan was incepted. This group of people decided to storm the U.S. border and use any makeshift projectile they could get their hands on, such as rocks and bottles, just like last year, to assault ICE agents who were trying to defend the border and the National Guardsmen who were there to assist them. During the assault, the order was given by the battalion chiefs of the National Guard to fire tear gas at the migrants who were storming the border, resulting in pictures like this one, picturing a Mexican mother dragging her unshoed children away from a tear gas bomb. And this is a picture that's been circling the internet since Sunday, in which people have been picking it apart as hard as they can, pointing out the fact that there were professional cameramen that were pictured in the background as soon as you enhanced the picture and changed the focus of it, and the fact that the children's feet were exceptionally clean for the fact that they had just walked all across Mexico. As soon as the picture surfaced and the live reporting began of the assault on the U.S. border, there was an immediate call to arms by people on Twitter and other forms of social media to condemn the president himself as well as the National Guard and anybody else who was involved for making this horrific assault on people who were assaulting the border at the time. One of the first tweets that I saw referring to the tear gas defense at the border came from a Qasim Rashid Esquire, who was replying to another user's comparison of the tear gas attacks to a chemical weapon. Jules Suzdaltsev tweets out, "Our government is firing chemical weapons at women and children over another country's border," in which Qasim replies, "Updated list of nations that have used gas on civilians." And then it made a list of various people who have actually used chemical weapons against their own citizens, ending at the United States with Trump. I don't think I need to explain how disturbing this is, but I will say it for time's sake. Rashid is comparing the use of Zyklon B by an anti-Semitic army to kill and ethnically cleanse 1940s Germany, or Bashir al-Assad using nerve gas on his own citizens after the United States told him not to our president using a well-meant and very common crowd control tactic that we use in this country almost any time there's any sort of hostage or riot situation. This is not the same thing. However, this tweet launched Twitter into the frenzy that it was already becoming and gave other people other talking points to scream about over the border crisis. Former Charmed star and political activist Alyssa Milano was quick to ostracize our president from an older tweet that he put out, screeching, of course, the fact, "You tear-gassed women and children, asswipe, and on Thanksgiving weekend, you piece of shit asshole, motherfucking evil creature person." I'm very charmed by Milano's words, trust me. But in all seriousness, the defense of tear gas that the National Guard used on the border to help deter and break up some of the people that were trying to storm the port of entry was almost a necessary facet of the defense, and whether or not there were women and children out there should not matter at this point. When Representative Swalwell of California was making many of the same claims about tear gassing and how it was horrible to do because there were women and children involved, I pointed out that I hoped that any criminal that ever invaded his house and tried to break in didn't put women and children in front of them, because any police tactics at this point would be useless and Swalwell would have no choice but to get robbed. And that's a big part of any other hostage situation. Hostage situations are luckily very rare in this country. We almost never hear about them, but many of them are still broken up by tear gas. It's generally a non-lethal form of ending a situation. It is true that tear gas can be lethal if taken in concentrated doses, or if people who are tear gassed stand their ground and don't come out for fresh air, they would suffocate on the fumes. That's part of the reason that it's used, because the brain's natural reaction is to come out for fresh air when one person is conscious and suffocating. The use of tear gas in this open air situation was originally intended to just move people back away from the point of entry and make sure that they were moving back and fighting to get the fresh, clean air and not storming the border so that the ICE agents could gain some semblance of control over the situation. It was a non-lethal attempt to take control of the situation and put everything back into order. While I don't necessarily agree with or condone the sentiment that was put forward in the tweet, Twitter user Dreg, also known as Cousin Eddie, had an interesting reply for Milano and brought up a very good point that I think that people in this country don't really want to think about as happening in other parts of the world, as a crisis like this is happening on our border. Dreg tweets, "Count your blessings, biatch. Were it up to me, it would have been live ammo." It's very important to think about the fact that in many other countries around the world, even first world countries, if this same set of actions would have happened, this actually would have been live ammo. If you had tried to do this storming into Russia or China or North Korea, even though we don't consider them to be allies or a civilized country at this point, or many other Middle Eastern countries that many people on the American left love to defend, this would have indeed been live ammo. There wouldn't have been any difference made the gender or age of the people that were storming at the border. They would have all been shot and mostly left for dead on the other side of the border for trying to storm the border and sneak into the country, or even worse, aggressively trying to come into these countries with heavy border defense. The story of the caravan is drawing to a close at this point. We probably won't see the very end of the story, but what's left now is to wait and see who gets processed for asylum in this country and who gets turned away back to Honduras, and who gets asked to stay in Mexico to take Mexico up on its offer of asylum for the people that they wanted to keep in the country and keep away from the U.S. border. As the assault on the border was drawing to a close, Mexican authorities stepped up and started arresting people that were trying to storm the border and was able to deport dozens of these people. This minor conflict was able to draw to a close with very few major injuries or casualties on either side. But the conflict did make a renewed interest in a border wall and border security, especially coming from our president. And I hope that it's renewed a sense of border security and the necessity to step up our game in border security in the American electorate. But that's something that we're going to have to watch in the weeks to come as the story draws to a close and as we look forward to whether or not we have another caravan come across Mexico in 2019. What did you think about the caravan? Did you ever see it as a threat? And what could we do the next time this happens to help resolve everything more peacefully than this particular situation was resolved? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.